James Gunn decided to take a job with Warner Brothers, and then given his choice of projects, he chose to do Suicide Squad. So that's where we're at with that. Working with Disney, tweets come out, fired from Disney, gets a job there, and then sometime after all of that, we find out that Disney and James Gunn had kissed and made up, and that James Gunn was going to go back and do Guardians of the Galaxy 3 once he was done with DC's Suicide Squad. However, it now looks like that timeline was completely different from reality. According to a story coming out now, in a result of an interview that James Gunn did with Empire, James Gunn has now revealed that he joined Disney again. He rejoined the MCU not months later, but rather the day after he accepted the job with Warner Brothers. Not the day after it became public that he had joined Warner Brothers and was doing Suicide Squad, but literally the day after that he privately accepted the job for Suicide Squad. Alan Horn gave him a call. They had talked it out and they had decided. This means the timetable was much, much earlier. Like a whole hell of a lot earlier than a lot of us think. That shouldn't surprise us because that's normally how it works in this business. We hear an announcement, but more times than not, the content of that announcement was actually probably settled months before they ever made it public. Like, for instance, when Ben Affleck was initially announced as Batman, they had actually agreed that Ben Affleck was going to be Batman like 3 or 4 months prior to them making the announcement. And that's what happens quite often. Anyway, here's what James Gunn had to say. This comes to us from the folks over at Empire. After hearing from Alan Horn, then of course, this is one day after he accepted, and it wasn't made public yet, but one day after he accepted the Suicide Squad job. After hearing from Alan Horn the next day, Gunn knew he had to update MCU head honcho Kevin Feige on his next project, who, when told it was a DC movie, Kevin Feige asked James Gunn, "Is it Superman?" James Gunn stated that it wasn't Superman, although that was a possibility, he tells Empire. A lot of people forget that one of the movies that DC offered James Gunn was, you want to do a Superman movie? He opted to go with Suicide Squad instead, and explained that he had chosen the Suicide Squad. Kevin Feige's reaction? Please, please make a good movie. Just make a great movie. While Marvel and DC have always been rivals, the big two in the comic book industry, Gunn hasn't had to keep his latest project secret from his friends at the MCU. Kevin knew who all the characters were months before we revealed them at Fandom, he says. He still knows who the villain is, writes James Gunn, talking about his interactions with Kevin Feige. All right. There's a couple of interesting things here that I think are kind of worth chatting about and worth talking about. One is this. Getting back to that main thing we were talking about, how I think we need to be reminded as movie fans quite often that by the time we do hear these announcements, they've been done deals for a long time. For example, there was actually a good period of time that passed from when James Gunn and Warner Brothers agreed for him to do Suicide Squad and when we actually found out about it. There was actually a good amount of time. After we found out about James Gunn doing Suicide Squad, it was still another good period of time after that we found out that him and Alan Horn had made up and that James Gunn was going to be coming back into the fold and doing Guardians of the Galaxy 3 after he was done with Suicide Squad. Finding out that he and Alan Horn actually had agreed upon that one day after James Gunn had agreed to do Suicide Squad really kind of drives that home, that a lot of the stuff gestates for a long period of time. The other interesting thing about this story to me is it reminds us once again, while those of us in fandom can act very childish at times, all of us included, the guy sitting in front of the camera, all of you watching it. Well, it's true that us fandom can actually act a lot of childish sometimes in this whole DC versus Marvel thing and getting all riled up. The reality is that a lot of the times the principal players in Marvel and DC are actually big fans of the other company. That actually happens a lot. I mean, the very first thing, and James Gunn later on describes the giddiness to Kevin Feige, like as soon as Kevin Feige found out James Gunn was doing a DC movie, he was like, is it Superman? Like he was all excited for maybe him doing Superman. Then finding out Suicide Squad, so dude, just go make a great movie. Kevin Feige went and visited the set of Suicide Squad, which I'm sure was pretty exciting for a lot of people there, having Kevin Feige there as well. And I think it's important and healthy for us as fans to remember that these principal players are actually fans of each other. Right? A lot of times the people at DC actually really like the Marvel movies, and the people of Marvel really like the DC movies. And it's good for everybody when the other succeeds, because they're all involved in making comic book genre movies. The better and higher profile and more popular the comic book movie genre becomes, it's good for everybody. That doesn't mean if DC makes a hit movie, that automatically means the next MCU movie is going to be a hit. That doesn't mean that, but it's helpful. It's helpful. That's all. And so when I was reading this story about James Gunn actually having rejoined Marvel a lot sooner than we thought, and then finding out about Kevin Feige's enthusiasm for what he was doing over at DC, I just thought that was kind of fun. And you know what? I am personally still secretly hoping, and I believe, I don't know this, but I believe that once James Gunn is done Suicide Squad and he goes back over to the MCU and does Guardians of the Galaxy 3, I believe we're going to see James Gunn still do another DC movie after that. Again, I don't know that. I don't have any facts to back that up. I'm just saying I kind of believe that's what's going to happen. So anyway, that's just kind of my thoughts on this. Question is, guys, what do you think about this story, about the fact that James Gunn actually rejoined the MCU a lot sooner than we thought, and the apparent enthusiasm that Kevin Feige had for James Gunn doing a DC film? Jump down to the comments section below and let me know your thoughts. All right, guys.